Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of the Information and Interface Design student-hosted events. First of all, a little bit of housekeeping. So this is our first event using this particular platform, so do bear with us if there are little bits of technical difficulties. We'll try and make it as smooth a ride as possible. On the right-hand side of your interface, I believe you should see a text box which allows you to ask or answer questions. May will basically be starting her talk in a moment, and she'd love it if you could ask her any questions throughout the event, and then we will come to them one by one at the end. And that is all. So just a quick intro to the project. This is and to May. This is called Tipitap. Can you beat the game of manipulation? The project that May's discussing here is a really brilliant example of the sort of challenging work that we see coming from our students. May was keen to understand how interfaces are designed not just for sort of seamless and frictionless use and content access, but how they hook into our intrinsic motivations and cognitive biases. So as a designer, she's highly accomplished in design, interface design, and also she's an accomplished programmer as well. And crucially, she's been using these skills to make interfaces that challenge the user to think about the motivations behind design. Before I introduce May properly, which only just realized that you cannot see my face. Now you should be able to. That's the first little bump. Before we start proper, here is a selection of events that will be coming up in the next week on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. A behind the interface talk from a selection of students from BA IID about the various aspects. And there's a COVID resilience talk where students, a panel of students will discuss their experiences of the lockdown and how creativity under lockdown can be facilitated. And finally, there's a talk from PhysNic, which is about exposing unsecured webcams. So without further ado, I'll remove my face and introduce May and give her her first slide. So May, your mic is muted at the moment, so ready whenever you are.
Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation, Tipitap. Can you beat the game of manipulation? Let's begin. Next slide, please. Tipitap is a super simple game. All you have to do is tap onto the heart and scroll down. You could watch this demo on the side here, or you could play using the link above on your phone. I believe Gareth has also put this onto the chat on the side. So it's super simple, and I really want to hear what scores you've gotten. My highest score was 60. So if you can beat that, definitely mention it in the chat. We're going to be having this lively leaderboard in a couple of minutes or so feel free to post your scores on the side. So Gareth, how is it going for you?
May, I've had a go and my performance has been subpar. I'm nowhere near 60. I'm approximately between 15 and 25 at the moment.
Means you're being honest.
I need some practice, shall we say. Oh, no, now I'm not. 28, hands up.
28. Can anyone beat 28? Mention that in the chat, please.
Oh, high score to beat.
All right, Gareth. Are there any scores in the chat that we can mention?
Not yet, May. I imagine they're all kind of ashamed that they're nowhere near your 60 high score at the moment. Let's see what we get towards the end of the talk, shall we?
Yeah, well, I guess it takes some practice. So let me tell you a bit about this project. Tipitap demonstrates manipulative tactics used in social media through the strategy of the game. The name of the game was inspired by the English saying tit for tat, meaning this for that, which was first used in 1558, but called tit for tat, a highly effective technique in game theory where the user using this strategy will first cooperate, then repeat the previous action of an opponent. This is shown in the game Tipitap, as it's intended to be a two-player game where both must have liked a post to win, causing a pause when the player sees that they've scored. You see, Instagram uses this technique to keep their users hooked. So if you have Instagram and you post a picture, you'll notice that you don't see everyone who's liked it right away. This is one way that Instagram keeps their users engaged. Next slide, please. User engagement. How do successful companies create products people can't put down? So displayed here are the average times that users spend on these platforms. The average user on TikTok would spend roughly around 38 minutes. On Instagram, 44 minutes. And on Facebook, 35 minutes. A former head of marketing at Facebook said in their speech that the average millennial checks his or her phone 157 times daily. That's a total of an average of 145 minutes every day. So they can feel connected, validated, and liked. This is equivalent to 55 seconds per instance each time. So if you haven't noticed, in the timer on the game, it's also set to 55 seconds. Next slide, please. So here's a diagram of the world's most used social media platforms. I'll just give you a moment to look at that and to read. Next slide, please. So how is user engagement measured? And is an app addictive if users spend more than 30 minutes daily on social media? So I put this question out in the open on the platform The Dots, and I came across these two interesting responses. The first response was, if you spend an hour on social media, you must be a social media addict. However, the second response was a bit more interesting. She mentions that an indicator of addiction is being how much you are removed from your general well-being, how much it affects your well-being, I mean. So does it make you feel anxious? Do you develop unhealthy habits? Are there anything unusual, such as withdrawal symptoms that you're experiencing? And she brings up another really interesting point, is that you have to consider, is it actually being addicted to the app? Or are you addicted to the stimulation that it gives? So we all have multiple apps on our phones. And there's some apps that we prefer more than others, so we would spend more time on them. So you automatically go to them in your downtime. But sometimes you can get that feeling of being lost and disconnected if you don't have that stimulation. So in the US, a senator called Josh Hawley created the SMART Act bill. That stands for Social Media Addiction Reduction Technology Act. Pretty wordy, I know. It's intended to prohibit social media companies from using practices that exploit human psychology substantially to impede freedom of choice. The statement is aimed in suppressing what Hawley calls social media addiction, to push big tech firms such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to alter the content which impacts the way the web products are used, such as banning the infinite scroll and autoplay on their platforms. And it could automatically hold the person's experience on the platform to 30 minutes a day. That's how long he's suggesting. This is supported by a study that I found in the University of Pennsylvania. It was in an issue of a journal of social and clinical psychology, published at the end of 2018, that it could lead to a significant improvement in well-being if users would spend up to 30 minutes on a platform in a whole day, not all at once. So the researchers found that students' well-being was improved. So if they limited their use of Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat to 30 minutes a day for 3 weeks, that they had a significant reduction in loneliness and depression, as compared to a controlled group that made no changes to their social media diet. So experimenting on 143 undergraduates was a reasonable sample. And the main age group, the main age group was appropriate as well, as they were using social media the most and compared to any other age group. But the Smart Act bill would allow the person to modify or remove the time limit and reset every month. So they're not completely strict. So users can't sense this like FOMO as they would now. When perceived as social actors or computer products, can leverage these principles of social influence to motivate and persuade. However, this is proof that isn't shown in the bill, but I have found this having researched it for my thesis to support this statement. Next slide, please. So what is persuasive technology? Dr. B.J. Fogg, founder of the Behavior Design Lab at Stanford University, my bad, he coined this term captology. It's the study of how persuasive technology influences human behavior through digital interfaces, such as mobile applications and websites. This area of study helps designers make informed decisions, since psychological and social theories are often very general and not specific to design practices. Designers can build a product that suits their target audience with only their understanding of aesthetics, but including this framework, they can create a visually attractive and persuasive technology product. The increasing sophistication of resources available to designers allows the user experience to incorporate persuasive elements in a continuously more discrete manner. So this diagram explains a model that a lot of these platforms use. It was formed by Mai Elamin, and it was found in his book, Hooked. So what he explains here is this cycle, which begins with a trigger, initiating the user-machine interaction that creates connection with the internal triggers that bind to current behaviors and emotions, and in turn form a new habit and become a part of one's daily routine. Now, Paul Fitts in 1954 examined the human motor system and showed that the time required to move to a target depends on the distance, yet it relates inversely to its size. By his law, fast movements and small targets result in greater error rates due to the speed accuracy trade-off. Although there are multiple variants in Fitts' laws, it all encompasses this idea. Fitts' law is widely applied in user experience UX and user interface UI design. For example, the law influenced the convention of making interactive buttons larger, especially on the finger-operated mobile devices. I'll give you an example. So when you're opening an app on your phone, you'll notice that the button, the physical one, is right at the bottom of the screen. So these platforms would purposely place buttons which they would want you to click on right nearby them. On to the next slide. So I'm going to talk to you about a common feature that we all know, the infinite scroll, also known as the pull to refresh. So, as Mai Elamin says, the next step followed by action is where the user would anticipate some kind of reward. This guy here that you see on this picture is called Lauren Brichter. He's a designer of the pull to refresh feature. He designed it in 2009 for Tweety, his startup, which was acquired by Twitter. Mainly because he could not find anywhere to fit this refresh, he designed it. And he placed this button on his app. He explains he never intended the design to be addictive, but would not dispute that it's similar to that of a slot machine, which is why in my research, I was trying to look into how are social media platforms using gambling methods to create psychological dependencies. And I found this as a similarity to pulling that slot machine down, the lever down, sorry. Since the design has become one of the most widely evaluated features in apps, the down pull action is for hundreds of millions of people, as intuitive as scratching an itch. Each time you slide it down, it's like a slot machine, but it seems to have a psychological function after all. Slot machines would be a lot less tempting if gamblers couldn't pull their own lever. And social media applications require little training for the user to navigate around that application. So on to the next slide. So this time round, when you're playing, please consider some of the things I've said. Tell us on the chat as well how it has impacted you. Has your score changed? Are you sliding a lot slower because you are thinking all these things? Are you noticing anything similar to your normal interactions? Now, on to the Q&A. Next slide, please. So Tipitap was an extension of my thesis, how are social media platforms using, how are social media platforms using gambling methods to create psychological dependencies? And you can read it here on this link. And if you're interested in the way I developed this project, you can also click this link. Gareth, so tell me what's going on.
Hello, May. I'm just going to post another request for the questions. Please post any questions you have in here for me. And I can give you an update on the scores if you like.
Sure, let's hear them.
We have, I'll give them to you in order of lowest to highest. We had Catherine with a, I'd say respectable 24 by my standards.
Good.
Then Rachel with a 40. She's quite despondent. She doesn't think she's ever going to get to 60. I feel like she's got it in her. And Oliver has got 44, and then with the high score is the show off Fiznik. So we've got some reasonably high scores there, almost as high as the maker of the game herself. So I'm waiting for any questions. There's a question here. actually, just one that's just popped in. I'll just publish that as well so people can see it. As you said, the pull to refresh feature wasn't intended to be addictive. Do you think the designers have a responsibility to consider for a feature or design to the world?
Can you repeat that again? It kind of cracked up, please.
Sure, no problem. You mentioned that the pull to refresh feature wasn't intended to be addictive originally. Do you think that designers have a responsibility to consider the addictive nature or have ethical questions placed against their designs before they're released to the world? Do you think they have a responsibility to do that?
I think every designer should follow a set of ethics. In terms of, like, for example, this infinite scroll, you have to realize that not every designer would realize what the consequences could be later down the line. But that is why user testing is really important. So then you can spot these things very early on into the process. And if you kind of ignore the fact of like user testing in any instance, you will fall into these traps. So you as a designer have the responsibility to catch these out. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that's interesting. An interesting idea and point in terms of having a framework. Everybody should have generally an ethical framework to work with. And I think in this discipline, yeah, there's perhaps a tendency for people as sort of engineering / design discipline to do things because they can. So there's questions to be asked. I'm going to ask another couple of questions from people. I'm going to start with personal versus work-related use of social media justifies its use in very different ways. Okay, so personal versus work-related use of social media. Does work-related use of social media, do you think that might affect personal psychology as well?
That's a really interesting question, because with a work-related, for example, I'm going to use Instagram. You can have a private Instagram and you can have a business page Instagram. So when you are creating a business page, you do realize what your intentions are. You want to gain those followers. You want to get people to buy into your product or service. So you're kind of more wary of your actions, whereas in your personal page, you're not as aware of the psychological impacts. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Mai. I think there's a history of psychological effects used in intentional ways through advertising in the past, and I think there's something to be linked between that perhaps in terms of how social media is used as a tool for products and for gathering awareness for a commercial reason, rather than how people also use it for gathering attention for themselves. Or your work seems to be a lot about how people have this kind of instinctive feeling about how it affects them or interfaces affect them. And so I think for me, there sounds like there is possibly a distinction in the areas of research for that. Another question from you, Mai. What do you think the future of social media looks like? That's a tough one.
Ooh.
Where's crystal ball?
Let me think about this. So if I was to be completely honest with you, since we're trying to enter this space of reality and augmented reality, and trying to really bring the virtual space and incorporate it into the real world, I don't think that we will be building platforms which are completely content based. We're going to be trying to move away from that and trying to integrate more things into our lives, such as these XR glasses, for example, and when Google put that advert of the Google glasses, how you can just wear these glasses and you see a screen, but it won't be the same way that you interact, for example, with a physical phone. So I really think that, like I said, platforms will become less content-based, and they will really try to consider what the user needs are by presenting them in the real world. What are your thoughts, Gareth?
I think that was a very astute answer. I think I don't know if I can beat that, May, to be honest. As not a particularly heavy social media user myself, I am not perhaps the best person to speak on it as well. But I find my movement away from social media is also based on feelings of anxiety, really, about how it might be affecting me. So I think I'm interested to know how this kind of this dialogue and this conversation about the effects of it is going to change the way platforms behave, or whether platforms become different, smaller, broken up, more specialized. That's what I'd be interested to see. I think the behemoths of social media they're almost too big to fail now, but they serve some sort of purpose. And how do you maintain that whilst reducing the negative impacts they're having?
I think going on, like building on your point, I feel like especially in this time of like Corona, a lot of platforms are like feeling this pressure to put as much content out there, especially Netflix. So I really think that platforms and these tech companies really have to start thinking outside of our devices, because that's what's important. We need to think about how are we going to improve our lives, not just through our phones.
So we've only got a couple of minutes left, and we've got a few more questions, but I'm just going to choose this one because they got in there first, I believe. How has your research and thesis informed your design? Which is an interesting question in terms of a quite research heavily driven practice that yours is, and the challenge that it is to make a holistic creative practice that it leans on research and manifests it in interesting and accessible ways. So how did you go about that, May?
I just wanted to put my research into practice, really. I wanted to test these things that I was finding out if they really were like happening. Like, there are many things that I found out that I was surprised, and I wasn't sure if that was, really possible. Like, am I really being affected by these design features? It really makes you realize a lot of things, and you just feel compelled to find out if they're actually true. So by building this game, I really wanted to see and test these things I was finding out. And that's what I often do with my work. Whatever I find out, I just want to see how can I visually represent them.
Great. Thank you, May. That's really interesting. Thank you very much for your talk. I have just put up your last slide because we nearly skipped that, which has your contact. Well, it has your blog, your portfolio, your GitHub, and your contact details on it. Thanks everybody for watching. And one last reminder of the events we have coming up from BA Information and Interface Design that are starting next Monday. Take a note of that URL. And you can from there access the Eventbrite and register. And that's it from us. Thanks again, May.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.